Okay, good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure. I'm very moved. My name is Yigal Zalmona. I'm an advisor on art and exhibitions to the National Library and the former chief curator of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it's a wonderful opportunity. You are a wonderful audience, and we know because you are many. I don't know exactly how many you are, but it's a big audience, it's a large crowd, and it's very moving. Viva Zoom. The problem is that we can't hear you and we can't even look at you in your eyes, but I can only hear the birds in my garden, and soon I will be hearing Emil, my friend. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Emile Schrijver from Amsterdam. Emil is a prominent Dutch scholar of the Jewish book, an expert in the history of manuscripts, of Jewish manuscripts, and the printed book. He's well known as a prolific exhibition curator, a museum director, and a leader in the context of Jewish museums. We will talk this evening about many things, about Jewish books, about Jewish museums, and about Jewish and non-Jewish Amsterdam. Amsterdam was for centuries a metaphor of freedom and liberalism. This was a city that knew how to welcome Jews and grant them rights and safety, since it warmly welcomed them in the 16th and 17th century when they arrived from Spain and from Portugal after they were expelled from those countries. Amsterdam became a safe harbor for all these Jews, a safe harbor, and gave them peace, of course. The Jews of Amsterdam called Amsterdam Mokum, Mokum meaning Makom in Hebrew, because they felt that it is really their place. But Amsterdam was also, as well, alas, a city whose policemen helped expel thousands of Jewish citizens in 1943 to Nazi extermination camps. 3/4 of the Dutch Jewish population was murdered, the greatest number of Jewish victims in Western Europe. So our conversation will take place between the light and the darkness, between two inspirational symbolic names or poles, Spinoza and Anna Frank. Now, Emil, let us be personal and mark together very quickly some significant stations in your career so that the audience will be able to get introduced to you. You served from 1986 to 1994 and from 2003 to 2015 as curator of the Rosentaliana Library in Amsterdam. This is, if I may say so, the Mecca of Jewish libraries in Europe. Can you, in a sentence or two, describe the Rosentaliana? So maybe instead of asking Professor Shriver questions and discussing about these points of his career, I will describe them myself in order not to waste too much time. But from, as I said, from 86 to 1994, and then from 2003 to 2015, he was a curator of the Rosentaliana Library, which is the largest Jewish library in Europe, at least. A wonderful place for study.
I'm there.
So I told them about the
I could hear. Thank you, Yigal. Okay, so you wanted me to tell about the Rosentaliana. Thank you.
One sentence, 2 sentences.
Welcome to everybody. I mean, it's very, I will repeat, Yigal, it's very moving to see the enormous number of people that are joining us. The Rosentaliana is a private library of a former German rabbi who was lucky enough to be able to build a library with the funds of his family-in-law. He spent most of his time as a book collector. He didn't have his own community. He was a so-called Klausrabbiner in German. And he was Eliezer Rosenthal, born 1794, died 1868. And 12 years later, 1880, his books were donated to the city of Amsterdam as a gift to the city and as a, I would say, a token of emancipation also of the son of Eliezer Rosenthal. And Leze Rosenthal's library was accepted, and from a small collection of some 5,200 volumes, it grew into I would say anything between 120 and 150,000 Jewish books, one of the larger, if not one of the largest Jewish libraries on the European continent. And I've been leading that for quite a few years.
What amazed me is that to learn that the archive of Jacob Israel Dehan is in the Rosentaliana.
It is.
It was a fascinating figure. A gay Haredi in Jerusalem was the victim of the first political murder.
Yeah, unbelievable guy. Yeah.
So interesting, yes. Now, since 2008, you are curator of the magnificent, really magnificent, René Braginsky Collection in Zurich. It's, I think, the most important private collection of Jewish manuscripts and books in the world, a one-at-a-time collection. And in 2015, you are managing the Jewish Cultural Quarter. We will discuss further the Jewish Cultural Quarter, which includes also the Jewish Historical Museum, which is going to be one of the main topics of our conversations. And you are, since 2017, the chairman of the Association of European Museums, Jewish Museums, and that's also an important anchor to our conversation. We will discuss all that. It is a special pleasure for us to host you, since you are an old, very good friend of the National Library. Whenever we seek your advice, you are ready to give it. You come to Jerusalem, you participate in committees, and really you are a wonderful friend. For me personally, it is a great joy to talk to you, even via Zoom, since we are collaborating on the preparation of an exhibition, which will be the first temporary exhibition in the new building of the National Library. And it will be an exhibition showing the Braginsky Collection in dialogue with the collection of National Library. And really, we are all looking forward that it happens in 2022, when the new building will be inaugurated. I would like Emil to start with a question of principle. Being on one hand an active and prolific academic researcher of the Jewish book, and on the other hand, you are a very active curator who has devoted much of his time and energy to the presentation of books and their visual context or the visual interpretation. How do you experience and encounter between these two endeavors? They seem to be very different, because on one hand, it's a research and an analysis of the book and the text as a vehicle of text and something to read, and at the same time an artistic object made to look at and to it's for the delectation, for the senses and for the eyes. Is it really a contradiction, or you find the way to put them together?
There's two questions. The answer to the last question is very easy. Yes, there are ways to put it together, but there is an element of contradiction. And I suppose that we should distinguish librarianship and museum curating. From the point of view of libraries, let's say the tension between a librarian on the one hand and a researcher of the book on the other hand is interesting. Librarians are concerned about the quality of their cataloging, about the presentation of their collections, but it can at times happen, and it did happen in the past, that, for example, libraries, to put it prosaically, sit on their digital material without publishing it because their so-called metadata, their cataloging data, are not up to par. And rather than publishing it in the best interest of the researcher, they decide to wait for it and to wait with publishing and wait for them to be their data, for the data to be perfect. I think that is a very negative development. At the end of the day, librarianship is yes, it is about taking care of the library. It is about taking care of the books, but you want to get your materials out to the researcher as soon as you can. And you should also try to develop means of communication with the research community to get their input for your cataloging. I think that is from the librarian's point of view. I think that it's in best interest of the researcher to get everything out there. And it's interesting in terms of digitization. Today is the world of digital, and even with COVID-19, we've become even more digital. In the age of digitization, the people actually make the decisions about what to digitize and what not to digitize are not the researchers, it's the librarians. So the librarian should find ways of communicating with the research community in order for them to cater to the needs of the research community. With museums, the situation is different. In the library, one could say that in an ideal world, with all the restrictions that especially the older material needs, in an ideal world, libraries can give access to the real thing and give access to the actual object. Museums cannot. Typically, a museum will have at least a piece of glass, a glass covering in front of the item, and what the audience sees is a choice made by a curator, and what the audience doesn't see is the rest that was not chosen by the curator. So and this is of course to young curators, one of the things you teach them is realize that your audience will never know what you didn't choose. So it's very easy to kill your darlings in advance of an exhibition because your audience doesn't know it. But you have to be aware, and it's a responsible task, what you're choosing and what you're not choosing. That's the same with the researcher. Research, in a way, as a researcher of the book, it is sort of, and as a researcher of ritual objects as well, it's sort of frustrating to walk into a museum and to realize that you're only looking at one page and that only with the help of digitization you can see the rest, and you're not physically able to work with the real thing. It's all about reality.
You really want to break the glass and touch the object yourself with your hands and fingers.
I mean, I wouldn't follow that impulse, but it is something that many researchers feel. I've been visiting a lot of exhibitions with colleagues, and I think that we all share this frustration that once the item is in an exhibition, it actually means that you cannot study it. But when you do reach out to a totally different audience, for me, the choice to move from academia, of which I'm still part, into the museum world, at the end of the day, was about the choice for a larger audience. You reach out to so many more people in a museum setting than you will ever be able to do in an academic setting, and that is it's about sharing the knowledge, but it will always be curated sharing.
Now, Emil, I would like you to turn for a moment into a tourist guide, to take us to Amsterdam, to take us to the Jewish quarter, a cultural quarter. But I give you a challenge. Take us also in a time machine, and let's go back 1 year to 2019. Before COVID-19, when everything was wonderful, when Amsterdam was a paradise, when you had 350,000 visitors. And after that, we will talk about the pandemic and so on, but let's see the bright sides of the picture. So take us to the cultural Jewish quarter.
And that is while sharing my screen, right? That's what you're inviting me to do.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect, I will.
And it's exactly where the Jewish historical quarter was. I mean, I think that 350 years ago, you could see Spinoza, that I mentioned before, walking in the streets and maybe crossing Rembrandt, who decided to move to the quarter because he wanted to paint and draw these interesting faces in order to use them in his biblical paintings. They live together, they're neighbors almost.
Yeah. Now I will try and bring you there. I've shared my screen here. You should be seeing it now. Please confirm.
Yes.
So I'm taking the Jewish Culture Quarter of Amsterdam. This was until 5 years ago the largest item that the Jewish Museum of Amsterdam, the most important item that it bought, or at least the most expensive item. It's interesting that in today's world of the Judaica market, we are tempted to define important by the price paid, which is of course nonsense, is the truth. The Jewish Historical Museum was started in 1930 with the foundation of the Jewish Historical Museum. It was officially opened on the 24th of February 1932. a small museum which was part of a movement, let's say of a phenomenon that took place all over Europe of the bourgeois Jewish community, bourgeois people within the Jewish community, realizing that with emancipation, a lot of the Jewish heritage was actually disappearing. And they felt it was about time that that should be taken care of. They developed the idea of Jewish museums. And for my colleagues, I know that this is a blunt simplification, but I can't do it any shorter than that. It was a very small place. So there were Jewish museums in Pressburg, in Vienna, all over Germany, smaller and bigger Jewish museums. And a phenomenon which really already started in the 19th century, that is the truth, that toward the, let's say, the last couple of decades of the 19th century. In 1940, it was closed by the Nazis, a collection of a few hundred items. And in 1943, that whole collection was transported to Germany. And the truth is that that particular confiscation was most probably the most, from the Nazi perspective, the most successful one, and also the most destructive one. That is so all libraries were transported to Germany as well. All archives, the majority of the archives were transported to Germany as well. But the one that really suffered, the collection that suffered most, was that very small collection of the Jewish Historical Museum. The Nazis did take care of the books and the archives. They stored them. They want them to be part of the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, the Institute for the Research of the Jewish Question, and by Alfred Rosenberg. And I would say that an important part of the collection of objects of the Jewish Historical Museum did not return, contrary to the large majority of the library and archive materials which did return. And it took until 1955 to reopen the museum in the same building, which is the Way building in the city of Amsterdam, a very small building, and only a small part of the collection returned. Whereas in 1946, the Rosenthaler had already reopened. Whereas in 1949, Etz Chaim Library had already reopened, to which I will return. It took until 1955, remained a small setup, but in 1987, the new Jewish Historical Museum was opened in 4 former Ashkenazic synagogue buildings. And what you see here is actually before the opening. And this is the so-called Schulgasse, the alley in between the 4 museums, which is now the entrance area. It's a 1987 photograph, and the Schulgasse is now covered, but it was actually the street in between the synagogues. And this gives you a sense of what it looked like. The Great Synagogue of 1671. The Oberschule, which was built 14 years later, which now houses our Children's Museum, 1685. The Drittschule, the third one, built in 1700 and extended 1778, which are now the offices. And the 3 on the top floor, actually, I'm in the lucky position that the 3 windows that you look at are the windows behind which I work. So that's things could have been worse. Then we go to the next one, the new synagogue, 1730, and with an extension in 1752. This had to do with the Ashkenazic influx in Amsterdam. The first Jews to settle in Amsterdam, of course, were the Portuguese Jews. Toward the end of the Sephardic Jews, toward the end of the 16th century, they would come to Amsterdam, 1596, 97, we're sort of certain. And they would come to Amsterdam and settle there. The Ashkenazic Jews came in the 1640s. There were a couple of hundreds of Ashkenazim before that, but with the big pogroms in Eastern Europe, especially the Chmielnicki pogroms, after the Portuguese had, so to speak, paved the way for the Ashkenazic Jews to come, a much larger community of Ashkenazic Jews did actually develop in the city of Amsterdam. If we continue, this is what the museum now looks like. This is the new synagogue, this is the Great Synagogue, I'm sorry. This is our new permanent exhibition, 1600, 1900. This is the Great Synagogue at the ground floor, which is the presentation about religion. This is the Neue Synagogue, the new synagogue, Neue Schule, the one that now houses the exhibition on the 20th and 21st century. And this gives you a sense of the quality of the collections in terms of the more traditional Judaic, and a wonderful painting by a Dutch painter in back of a synagogue service in that very same Great Synagogue, 1935. We have a children's museum. We were among the first to actually have a children's museum in the building that I already showed to you. with a couple of works of art by Elie Content, a Dutch Jewish artist of whom we are now showing a wonderful exhibition. And in the year 2009, in principle, we opened it in 2012. We presented the idea of a Jewish Culture Quarter after we took over the management of the Portuguese Synagogue. The majestic Portuguese Synagogue, one of the most important synagogues that we have in Europe, and I would say a synagogue that has been followed in many places, if only in the Bevis Marks Synagogue, for example, in London. It's still no electricity, no electric light. And when people return to Amsterdam, or if we take us to before COVID, we would organize a concert with hundreds and hundreds of attendants every month in the ice cold or very warm Portuguese synagogue, lit with at least 1,000 candles. Majestic. If we continue, we look here at the Portuguese synagogue and we see the inscription above the opening, above the door. And if we take a look at it more carefully, it has a chronogram with 1672, the year that was consecrated. So this was not the first synagogue that the Jews of Amsterdam built. I just mentioned 1596, 97, they came to Amsterdam. 1603, they made their first community. Like a good Jewish community, there were more than one. So the three Jewish communities united in 1639. And this reunited community, Talmud Torah, developed the most majestic, one of the most majestic synagogues in the world, the Portuguese Esnoga in Amsterdam, as they call it. The chronogram, the Beit Yud Tav, final Kaf, refers to 1672, but it was a year's disaster in Amsterdam. It was consecrated a couple of years later, 1675. But it's interesting, if you look at the same chronogram, and it says, and you look at the Hebrew word avo, and the first letter bet, you can read Abuav. And Abuav was actually the name of the chief rabbi of the community, Yitzchak Abuav Fonseca. So the name of the chief rabbi of the community is actually hidden in the chronogram on the page. And apart from that, and this is an element of vanity, of course, apart from that, the community, the Portuguese Synagogue, also houses the oldest Jewish library in the world, 404 years old. I can do the math, but I had 1618 and forgot to change the 404. I've shown this page before. One of the most important Jewish libraries in the world, oldest Jewish library in the world, approximately 30,000 volumes of printed materials and approximately 600 very important Hebrew manuscripts. And this gives you a sense of you're looking at a reconstruction, this 19th century reconstruction of a 17th century library. This is the oldest section, the part of the library that was used by the rabbis for the school of the community and for the preparation of their services. This is one of the pristine pieces kept in Etz Chaim in Livraria Montesinos, a wonderful Omer counter, very typical Amsterdam kind of Omer counter, done in the let's say 1740s, 1760s. We don't know exactly, but we know of a handful of Omer scrolls as majestic as this one. I have the entire collection of manuscripts online. You can view them at manuscripts.nl, and it was done by Ardon Bachama, who also works with from Ranana, who also worked with the library, and is one of the best web pages on Hebrew manuscripts that I know. The Jewish Culture Quarter is bigger than just majestic cultural heritage. Hollandse Schouwburg, the Dutch theater, literally the so-called Umslagplatz, or deportation center during the Second World War, is also part of our endeavor. It was used between 1942 and 1943 to deport at least 46,000 Jews from Amsterdam and outside Amsterdam to the concentration camps. And it was used because of the tram that would halt there in front of the building. And you can use it on the right, you see the registration of the people. It was considered to use the Portuguese Synagogue, but the Portuguese Synagogue could not be blinded, didn't have electricity, didn't have light, and seemed to be not the perfect space to do it. This is a theater where nobody can see what was going on inside. People would typically stay there 2 to 3 nights and would then be put on the tram or in trucks and would be sent to the stations. And from the stations, they would be sent to Westerbork, and from Vught, and to Westerbork and Vught, the transition centers, they would be sent to the east. And then opposite the street was a Jewish daycare center and a Jewish kindergarten. And when the Schouwburg, the theater, was too full, people would, they would ask the children in the Schouwburg to go, they would bring them across the street to the Jewish kindergarten, and children up to the age of 12, 13, maybe even 14, spend a few nights there, and were then reunited with their parents and were sent to the camps, and sent to the death. And the adjacent to the kindergarten was a Protestant teacher school. You can see the director of the teacher school here on the left, and the director of the Jewish daycare center, and this director of the Protestant teacher school developed a relation of trust between them, and they developed a smuggling route which saved approximately 600 children. Children would spend 1 or 2 nights in that Protestant teacher school and would then be smuggled out of that building with the help of all kinds of resistance groups. And we are working with these 2 locations, with the Hollandse Schouwburg, which has actually been a commemoration center since early 1960s, and is part of the Jewish Historical Museum endeavor since 1992. The stronger emphasis on Holocaust education, and the development of a National Holocaust Museum in the building of the former teacher training college, of which we finished the first phase in February 2020, literally a month before COVID-19, with a total finished capital campaign of more than 30 million euros. And we will reopen that in the fall. And if things don't go too bad, it will actually happen. And it will then, the central hall of Hollandse Schouwburg will then look like this. And the facade of the new National Holocaust Museum will look like this. It will look like this at night. It's a wonderful new building by an Israeli architect, by the way. We have an Israeli exhibition designer, Israeli architect. And it's not a deliberate choice. We chose the best. How about some nationalism in the presentation? And this is the space where the children were put into safety through the daycare center, were actually handed over the fence. And this is the division between the Holocaust Museum and that particular space. And the last one that I want to show is just some. This is not the Jewish cultural quarter, but it is what Yigal and I are working on together. It's the Braginsky Collection, because we launched, I would say, 3 weeks ago, the new Braginsky Collection app, and everybody with an iPad, not another tablet, I'm afraid, is invited to download it. Then I have a favorite object, but I think that Yigal should actually tell me when to show that favorite item.
Okay, you can show it now. Since we are dealing with the museum, it's interesting to see it now. Okay,
so I will continue. I don't want this to be a presentation only. This is my favorite item. Who would have thought that it would be a book? It's a very old Machzor, the Amsterdam Machzor. Amsterdam Machzor, it is called because it was donated to the very community in which the Jewish Historical Museum is housed in 1679 by a Jewish printer by the name of Uri Feivish Halevi. He was the grandson of Moses Uri Halevi, the first rabbi of the Portuguese community of Amsterdam, an Ashkenazi rabbi from the city of Emden, who became the first rabbi of the Portuguese community. He came from the city of Emden, and it's most likely that he brought with him a medieval Machzor, which has 2 annotations in the margins which say that it represents the Minhag Colonia. And if we look at it very carefully, we look at the Minhag of Cologne, if we look at it very carefully, it's quite clear that indeed it follows the order of Piyutim and the order of other special prayers that you would include in the yearly festival prayer book, as it would have been done in Cologne. In Ashkenaz, in the 13th century, there were big differences which Piyutim would be sung, which hymns would be sung during the high holidays, and which wouldn't. And this represents the rite of Cologne, so much is for sure. The dating is critical. It can be 1250, it can be 1260, it can even be 1270. And the truth is that when I once asked Malachi Betarier, one of the great leaders and very well connected to the library as well, one of the great leaders of Hebrew manuscript research about the particular manuscript, how old it is, and he said, Kadum, early. And one of the things that I've learned is that the further you get into the field, the more insecure you become about your datings. I've dated certain items that I now believe may well be 10 or 20 years younger or may well be 10 or 20 years older. The truth is that I simply don't know. And the truth is that it's probably also not all that important. It's 1250, 1260. It's a wonderful piece. It's beautifully illuminated. It's a combination of the city of Cologne and the city of Amsterdam, where it is part of the synagogue in which we are now. We have a lot of illustrated pages, and some of them maybe later. We're actually looking at one of the one on top maybe a little bit later. And as you can see, the ones who can appreciate the text, it's largely the PO team that you're looking at, largely the press. Untitled Chapter, the very famous Amnon of Mainz, very, very famous Piyut. And it was used in the community. It was used within the Jewish community of the city of Cologne, for example. It continues and continues. Beautiful. In the Tzena and Arena appears a couple of times. It appears here. It's a quote from the Song of Songs, the 3rd chapter, and here continues Tzena and Arena. There's a lot to say about this, which has actually all been said in a small booklet that was published recently in Cologne, because the acquisition, but I'll come to that. This is probably the most famous page, the page with the Aleinu. It's the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. It says Aleinu, and on the left you have a Piyut, Ochila, and on the right you can see the leader of the ceremony wearing a talit or some sort of gown and having the text of the Aleinu prayer in his hand. He's wearing the Jewish pointed hat, which identifies him as a Jew, which was considered negative, but not always by the Christians, which it was an identifying element for the Jews, which they apparently didn't consider negatively either always. I mean, of course it's a negative sign, and didn't mean that he was actually wearing them. It's just an element of identification. He's wearing he's the Shaliach Tzibur, he's the messenger for the community. He's the one who brings the prayer to God. And you can see here that even his face was apparently eradicated afterwards. He had a human face, which is an element which some art historians believe points towards a very early dating, because later on you could see that within Ashkenaz, the second biblical commandment and the problems of at least making human faces was in the way. And it's apart from signs of the zodiac, which also appear around Pesach, this is the only really figurative element, or at least a representation of man. And it is really a symbol of the importance of such a machzor, which is owned privately. It may well have been owned privately, actually, by one of the prominent members of the Cologne community, as Avi Steiner has recently proven. But it is at the same time, although it may have been a private commission, it is the ownership, it's the property of the community, and it's the community's way of communicating with God during prayer. And the Shaliach Tzibur is actually the communicator of that message on behalf of the community towards the deity. And I think that it's such a very very touching illustration there. And it also goes to show the change in the importance of the talit. The talit was originally, before the 12th century or before the 10th, 11th century, more of a covering during the prayer than a prayer shawl with fringes. And here you can see in the intermediate stage, and it's the member of the, there's a lot more to say about this, but this is the most important representative of the community. There's a big book being prepared under the guidance of Katrien Kokman-Appel, and one of the leading art historians of or probably the leading art historian of the medieval Jewish book, and she will deal with it in much more detail. Mika Mocha, and I skipped the Kol Nidre, so there's a lot going on there. This is actually the last slide that I have, and I will stop sharing the screen with you as soon as I...
Emil, how would you describe the public that comes to the museum? Is it a museum made for Jews only, for non-Jews? Is it mixed? How many young people come to the museum? How can you define the public that comes to the museum, or that came to the museum? You're speaking of 2019.
Yeah, well, now it's very easy. Now it's people living around Amsterdam or the few tourists that we still have. But
I understand, but
before that, it depended on the. So we had a total of between 350 and 375 visits to one of the sites of the Jewish cultural quarters: the Jewish Historical Museum, Children's Museum, Portuguese Synagogue, Holocaust Memorial, and Holocaust Museum. The Jewish Historical Museum typically has the regular tourists that would come to the Jewish, that would simply visit a Jewish museum, that would visit Berlin, that would visit London, Manchester, whatever, and our local visitor who will either come for the Jewish Historical Museum for the permanent exhibitions, or will come and visit one of our temporary exhibitions. We have a program of approximately 12 temporary exhibitions per year, smaller and bigger, and also depending on the funding, of course. And the large majority of local visitors will probably come, we know that as a fact also, will probably come for the temporary exhibition program. The Portuguese Synagogue is all about tourism. So we have a lot of tourist groups. We have a lot of organized visits, cruise ships. There won't be one cruise ship landing in Amsterdam or coming into Amsterdam this year or this morning. So cruise ships, organized group visits by tourists, Jewish tourism largely, but not only. The Holocaust Memorial is visited both by non-Jews Americans, by Jews Americans, Israelis, and non-Jews who take that as a central place within their neighborhood, because it's a very it's a very busy neighborhood where the Holocaust Memorial is. The Holocaust Museum is really dependent on the temporary exhibition that we did in the first 3 years of intermediate period in which we tried to do it. I would say that if I were to give a number, which is a total guess, if I were to give a number of the number of people, I would say that way more than half of our visitorship may well not be Jewish. It's tourists, Dutch visitors, and this is true, I think, of the large majority of Jewish museums in Europe. Visitorship, I think, if you go to Berlin, where things might change a little bit now, we all know about the difficult relationship of the former leadership of the Jewish Museum Berlin with the Jewish community. If you go to, and they reopened their permanent exhibition this week. Actually today is the first day that people can visit it. If you look at the visitorship, I was told that there was even up to 85 to 90% of visitorship not being Jewish. So that is a real challenge for Jewish museums. On the one hand, to deal with the identity issue of being a Jewish museum on the one hand, and at the same time being, as Barbara Kishenblatt put it, a place where everybody, even without the slightest connection with Judaism, will find a safe space to learn about and understand Judaism and Jewish history and Jewish culture.
I think that she's with us today. So, hello, Barbara.
Okay, hi, Barbara. Yeah, I hope I'm quoting you correctly. Yeah. So this is, I could expand, but I think this generally, it's a real challenge for Jewish museums to, and of course we get to another point, which is how do you define that Jewish identity? What does it mean? We're state funded. 48% of, and actually the truth is that in light of COVID, one of the reasons why we can still breathe relatively comfortably, in spite of let's say 30% of visitorship maximum at the moment, is that we were given additional state support, other than many other museums where they're not. So there's some 35 museums in the Netherlands that are considered of national importance, and we're one of that. And that actually provides us with the means to survive.
What is the budget of the museum?
It depends on what you count with. We have a $10 million budget approximately yearly. And more than half of that is being provided by the government. We earn another 1.5 to 2 million yearly, and we raise the rest basically, which we need. Raising the money is largely to pay for the temporary exhibitions. And we ran a separate capital campaign for the National Holocaust Museum, which was a 30 million euro campaign, which is big, of course. I mean, it's a load of money. But we did it. And also there, if you look at the 30 million euros that we got 6 million from the national government, 5 million from the municipality, a few 100,000 from the province. We raised 4.5 million privately, largely Jewish, but not only Jewish money. We got 4 million from the Bundestag, from the German parliament, which was a tremendous gift. And a lot of foundations, the Claims Conference, other American donors. So it's really a mixed bag of Jewish and non-Jewish governmental, official, and private organizations all over the world that help us to do what we do.
Mm-hmm. Emil, you once said, I'm quoting, societies want museums to be more interesting, more involved, and more vulnerable. As well that the museum should be vulnerable. So what did you mean by vulnerable? How can a museum be vulnerable, and how it became a value? I guess that all the museum moved to it changed. Instead of being authoritative and expressions of power, they are more open to weakness, they are more open to questions, they are more open to democratic dimensions, they are more open to doubt, they are not heroic anymore, they are not the authority. Did you mean that?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
What is vulnerable?
Well, for me, there's a wonderful quote which I've quoted too often, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Which is from two British museologists, who said that a museum should be a safe space for unsafe ideas. That is a conception. I really like that, and that is a conception of what a museum should be today, which is different from your traditional museum, where the museum is basically a sender of information. We have to respond to what is going on in society. We are asked about responses to such topics as racism, anti-Semitism, inequality, the civic society. When the idea for a National Holocaust Museum, to give you an example, was raised in Amsterdam in around 2010, 2015, between 2010 and 12, there was a lot of cynicism, even among the Jewish community. Is that still necessary? Is it still necessary that now we do a National Holocaust Museum? It was never done and suddenly we need it? And the reason for that, and we changed that, the way in which we changed that, in which we said there is an importance in understanding that history for today's world. And that was the point at which people started to understand why we do this. So we can no longer present history without presenting various opportunities for interpretation. And without leaving the freedom for interpretation, it's a different kind of curating. So it's not so much about the sender, but it's about interaction with the audience. What does it mean in terms of vulnerability? It means that with the openness that we're supposed to have, we are in a position in which we share our doubts, in which we make choices which other people may dispute. We will do a small project on anti-Semitism and racism opening up in Amsterdam in March. It's not a big exhibition, because a big exhibition takes 3 years to prepare. And I want to respond to what's going on in society. So we do a small presentation that is vulnerable, because in today's discussions on racism, on Black Lives Matter, on the role of the Jews, and on the competition between racism and anti-Semitism, if I put it very bluntly, people, the hierarchy of misery, basically, that is something that is a topic that was only part of the mission of a small number of museums, is becoming mainstream. And with the demands on openness that that society puts on us, we also get the vulnerability of the public space, of social media, of loads of opinion, of people who differ with you of opinion. It has to do with the way in which the world communicates as well. We have to respond swiftly. We have to do things digitally. We have to broadcast live all the time. We were not used to do that. We were used to think about things. We were used to curate, to write, to send, and we're not. And museums today are more, have to be more about interaction. It's a good development, but it's a change. It's also inevitable.
So how do you work on it? You have groups of people who sit together and discuss all these kind of issues?
Yeah, and we try to bring in, it's interesting because the museums are typically, how would I put that? A museum is never a unity. There will always be departments. Departments have different skills. It's the strength of a museum that you have so many different groups of skills. But the educator will have a different opinion on what a museum should do with anti-Semitism than my PR manager, or than my online content producer, or than my 25-year-old junior curator, or my 60-year-old senior curator. And what you see now is really that is really an important divide as well. When Black Lives Matter became relevant, majority of American museums responded with some sort of statement in which they expressed some sort of connection to the ideals of the movement. Many Jewish museums did so as well. Certain European Jewish museums did so. When we hesitated, is this appropriate, especially in COVID times, for us to do it? Is it necessary that we do it? It was actually the downward pressure from the younger constituency of my curatorial and my publication staff that convinced me it was necessary to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a different, and the pressure to express ourselves also came through us, especially during COVID when we had no visitors, through the social media channels. I don't get that many angry letters. I only get funny tweets and stuff. So the world is really changing in that respect. It's not only an advantage, but it's also a fact, and we have to respond to these facts. And I think that is a real serious change for museums. And it's easier. That's something to add. It's easier for larger places than for smaller places. One of the things we have to realize, both in the US, in Israel, and in the Netherlands, is that there's no such thing as the Jewish museum. The Jewish Museum Berlin has up to 200 staff. Berlin, Jewish Museum Moscow, they have hundreds of staff. We have approximately 100. We have 125 volunteers. We have 350,000 visitors. Prague is 700. Berlin has 700,000. So Berlin has 700,000 visitors. So that said, a small Jewish museum in Rhodes, or in Athens, or in Girona, will never have that kind of visitorship, will not be part of that, will perhaps be different also in terms of the liberty. Look at the situation in Budapest, the liberty that museums will have to express themselves in political situations. There's no such thing as the Jewish museum. It's a matter of size, it's a matter of country, it's a matter of tradition, it's a matter of funding. They're all worried basically about their existence today, with the exception of the ones that are publicly funded. And I'm, even in spite of the fact that we are publicly funded, I'm still worried. Because I don't want to, how am I ever going to motivate my curators to do an exhibition if they know that they're going to do an exhibition for 30% or 40% of my traditional visitorship?
Which brings me to one good big question, and that's your Shoah project, your Holocaust Museum, the one you are working on it. It's going to open, I think, in 2022, exactly like the National Library in Jerusalem. And it's a complicated question. What is a Holocaust Museum? I think that before the Washington Holocaust Museum, this wasn't a very clear concept. Have to have a Holocaust Museum. I think Yad Vashem in Jerusalem was a Holocaust memorial, but not a museum. They had an exhibition of art done in the camps or in response to the Holocaust, but they didn't have material related to the atrocities of the Holocaust. Now, the big museum in Washington really was a change maker. And since then, we have a lot of Holocaust museums all over the world. I think I counted about 60 of them. And the question with the Holocaust Museum is double, I think. I have two questions to put on the table before we discuss it. One, I think people always said in Washington that the Holocaust Museum was invented, was done in order not to have more Holocaust in the world, so that the Holocaust from the 40s will be the last one. And we all know that a lot of genocide happened since the construction of the Holocaust Museum. Mass murders are done every day. So the museums are not helping the society to get rid of mass murders and of genocides. Another question is is genocide a Jewish question? And a third question, or second big question, is the fact that the idea to have Holocaust museums come most of the time from the Jewish community. It's a Jewish interest. And my question is, could we say that since Jewish identity weakened, and you can't really put the finger on what is a Jewish identity, the Shoah, the Holocaust, became an important component of Jewish identity. So even the big, large museum of Holocaust in Washington is an answer to the question of Jewish identity. So in that sense, what is directing your thoughts regarding the Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam?
Well, first of all, it's a museum about the murder of the Jews in the Netherlands. So we're not a Holocaust museum like the bigger ones with the, let's say, with the overall purpose of let's say, Washington, Skokie, or Yad Vashem. Mm-hmm. So we concentrate on the situation in the Netherlands. And one of the reasons why we did it is that there was no such thing as, there were only local initiatives, local commemorations in the Netherlands that dealt with what had happened at the particular place during the Second World War and during the Holocaust. So that is number one. When my predecessors opened the Jewish Historical Museum in 1987, they deliberately, or in the new building, they deliberately chose not to present Dutch Jewish history only on the basis of 5 years of destruction, catastrophe, but rather as a successful history of 400 years, in which these 5 years of catastrophe were an important part. But it was not the defining moment in Jewish history, not a defining moment in the 400 years of Jewish history in the city of Amsterdam, or more than 400 years. At the same time, the 4 synagogue buildings that I showed to you at the beginning are 4 synagogue buildings that were no longer in use. And why were they no longer in use? Because the Jewish communities had perished. So you can never deny the fact that these Jewish communities were no longer there. That said, things changed, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years. And the most important, and the more Jewish museums that deal with this topic, O&M says the Small Jewish Museum in Austria has a very important exhibit on that going on at the moment, which is the fact that the witnesses, the eyewitnesses, the survivors are leaving us very quickly. I mean, even children who were born during the Second World War will be in the 70s now. So so we don't have many survivors left compared to the number of survivors that we used to have. And with the ownership of survivors of that history disappearing, not their ownership disappearing, but the survivors disappearing, we felt that it became more important to take over that ownership of telling that part of the history. But we deliberately chose to make it part of the Jewish Cultural Quarter. We have a synagogue complex which tells Jewish history. We have a children's museum which is all about Jewish life and the celebration of Jewish life, not about Jewish death. We have the Portuguese Synagogue, which is the continuation of Jewish life, a living community. There's still services being held and a museum function. We have a Holocaust Memorial and a Holocaust Museum in a different place, 500 yards away, which we can separate from the rest of the endeavor. And the overall offer is what defines us. So we make a deliberate attempt not to self-define ourselves not to define ourselves as an institution that is all about the Holocaust. But we cannot deny that the interest in the Holocaust is becoming bigger rather than smaller, and that with everything that is going on in the world, I would say the demarcation point, everything that there is no genocide in the world that's been thought through more than the Holocaust, legally, psychologically, medically, politically, whatever. And it's also a fact that many Jews do define themselves through their their family history and through the destruction of their family members, rather than being connected to religious institutions or rather than being connected to the culture. So we can see a very important change, I think, in the world, in the Jewish world. And if you see the leading Jewish institutions, the World Jewish Congress, a couple of the other leading institutions, they will always make some sort of connection with the Holocaust. At the same time, I saw a question about Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial is as big an issue in the Netherlands as it is elsewhere, but it hasn't become mainstream politics, but it's there. It is also important that the story is being presented to the world, but it can only be valuable for today's world if we are willing to make people understand how this could happen. Primo Levi said it has happened, so it can happen again. It did happen, so it can happen again. It won't happen the way it happened, but it takes a number of steps to get there, a number of very important steps to get there, and these steps can be repeated. The result may not be the same, but if you want to understand the stages of what is necessary for the genocidal process, you have to set groups of people apart. You have to take them rights. You have to dehumanize them. You have to the whole set of things that is necessary. It is very important for society to understand that, and there's hardly a better example and hardly a more necessary example than the Holocaust. So I think that is the reason why we do it now, why we want to make the connection, why we present it as a unique thing. Dan Michman, who's connected to Yad Vashem, Dutch historian by birth, he once said that the uniqueness, and I don't like the idea of discussing the uniqueness of the Holocaust as opposed to other genocides, but it is about the fact that it was more than killing the people. It was about eradicating a culture, and it was about taking out a chapter of Europe's cultural history through the destruction of the people. And that is a unique case, and it's in the best interest of today's society, of the future of our youngsters, to understand that. And that's why we do it. But we do it within the larger framework of everything Jewish. But interestingly, the younger generation is interested. They're interested in eyewitnesses. They're interested in hearing the stories. They're interested in survivors conveying the history, and they're interested in understanding how on earth it could have happened.
And can you foresee the reaction of the non-Jews to the Holocaust Museum? I mean, with the increases of anti-Semitism, will it be another step of increasing anti-Semitism? People would want to be confronted to that memory?
Well, that gets you to the first question that you asked initially, which is to what extent do museums, to what extent can museums take an influence on what is going on there? First of all, I think there should always be space for idealism. So if I convert 10 anti-Semites a year, I'm happy. It's 10 anti-Semites. But it's not, at the end of the day, it's about what you do is you present, you intervene in something that is going on in society. And you have a curated intervention into discussions. You provide people with curated information, and they do with it what they want. You do that through your event program, you do it through your educational programs, you do that through your education, and you also do that through your public profile as an institution. I'm not afraid. As so far, we opened up this temporary National Holocaust Museum, and it was not a source of additional anti-Semitism. But the problem is, of course, that the people whom you want to reach will not come to that museum. That's the problem of Holocaust museums in general. That is why it's so important that you bring school classes. It's all about the education of youngsters. Before the seed of anti-Semitism is growing into a plant, you want to take away the seed. And you want, and that is so that, and if you reach, so it's all about, we reach 45,000 school children a year in the Jewish cultural quarter, or we used to reach 45,000 school children a year in the museum. We have a goal to reach out to basically all school classes in the greater Amsterdam area of people going to high school. We want them to visit the museum once. That is why, and the number one target group for this museum, apart from the traditional visitor, apart from people interested in history, are learning. And the learning can be students, can be school pupils, can be children as of the age of 10 or 12, not younger, I suppose. In the Children's Museum, they will learn that they can be younger in the Jewish Historical Museum, and they will learn about values in Jewish life, about loving your neighbor like yourself. And but the learning can also be the local police, or it can also be the people working in the trains for the train companies who were actually involved very much so in the workings of the Holocaust in the Netherlands. So there are many ways to define someone who's learning. It's all about the learning, about providing, especially in today's world, Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, providing reliable information. What I said before, safe space for unsafe ideas. We present safe ideas. We can be trusted. Museums can be trusted. It's a big task, but museums can be trusted as a space where people can rely on the information. And will people object to it? Of course. That is the vulnerability of the public realm that I mentioned before. Is that a problem? No, of course it isn't. We're a free world. There's free exchange. And we expect, I mean, our calculations, we're only talking about 80,000 to 100,000 visitors yearly for the National Holocaust Museum. In the normal world, we expect a lot more than that, actually. And the idealism is on a meta level. It's about the daily interaction between the museum professional and the museum guide and the museum docent on the one hand, and the visitor, where the real effect is. It's very difficult to measure that, but you can do so also by training. We developed in Amsterdam a training method for museum docents and guides, which we call I Ask, in which we invite.
Wonderful.
Yeah, in which we invite our visitors to share their preconceived ideas of Jewish identity, of Judaism, of the Holocaust with the guide. And the guide is trained not only to invite people to share that, but also to communicate with them, so that you don't get a one-sided. This again about sending one-directional or bidirectional. You want to have a bidirectional kind of communication going on between the museum professional and the visitor. Actually, in the other way around, between the visitor and the museum professional.
I think that Israelis will be interested in to which extent Israel is part of this identity circle of the Jewish Museum. Because two of your predecessors were Israelis. You made a lot of exhibitions of Israeli artists. I know how much Israel was part of all what happened in Berlin. The relation to Israel in Jewish museums is a complex question, and I would like to ask you to relate to it shortly.
When I became a chair of the Association of European Jewish Museums, in the first meeting that I chaired, I asked how many, and it was in 2017 or 2018 was the first public chairing. I asked how many of you will do an exhibition on the Foundation of Israel, 1948, 2018, 70 years of the State of Israel. Hardly any. Most Jewish museums are afraid to organize exhibitions that are clearly connected to Israel, to Jerusalem, which has everything to do with the politics. For me, it is vital that we, as a Jewish museum, we show to the world, with all the BDS that is going on, the boycott and disinvestment and everything, that with all the anti-Israel feelings that are there in the cultural world, both of libraries and of museums, it is vital that we show to the world that Israel is a natural partner for the Jewish Museum. So we invite Israeli artists to work with us. I invited an Israeli-born curator to do a show of Uri Katzenstein. We have two artists living in the Netherlands, Gila Motti, who do very interesting shows, who will do a show in Amsterdam soon. And they will relate to their Israeli identity. Yep. Many Jews in Amsterdam, many Jews in the Netherlands do define themselves both through their Jewish heritage and through their identification with Israel. So I think it's part of who we are. So far, I'm not afraid to do so. But we are among the museum. Holland is politically, it's a relatively stable country in spite of everything, certainly compared to many others, and I feel confident to do so. At the same time, I mean, when we deal with the topic of anti-Semitism, with the topic of Holocaust, with everything, it is such a complex situation. If you talk about the connection that so many people make between the Jews being victimized during the Shoah, and now suddenly being, I'm quoting, suddenly being the perpetrator in Gaza. Why am I supposed to think something about that? I'm entitled to an opinion, but why should I be sharing that opinion as a museum with the outside world? A museum is a place where artists, curators have a stage in which they can relate to that topic. And it doesn't define me, and I want to be the space where that is being done. Mm-hmm. So if we define the connection with Israel, and there's no reason that it's just a fact, a statement of fact. If we define ourselves also through our relationship with Israel and with the state of Israel, give the stage either to your curators or to your artists, to Israeli artists, to non-Jewish artists, and to Jewish artists to deal with the topic. It's an open space. And if we give up on doing that, if we forget to do that, we're lost. We should, and there will be political pressure, and there will be criticism, and I mean, in spite of everything, with the interference in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, they have a new director. She happens to have worked for us for 30 years in Amsterdam. Sure. She does a wonderful job there. They have
everything is in the family.
So it's we've been able to survive. And but this is a big deal. I mean, and I'm talking from a country where everything is liberal, and it's different in certain countries. It's different in Poland. It's different in Russia. It's different in all kinds of Eastern European countries, even in Southern European countries, and it's different again in Israel. So, let alone the US. We have a lot of people from the US.
Yeah,
people from South Africa. It's difficult all over the world. But as soon as we shy away from the discussion, we're losing some of our part of our reason for being there, of our raison d'être.
It's a wonderful answer, I think, and this idea of the museum as an open space in the real and deep sense of the word is, for me, what I take from our conversation. Doron, should we give the floor, the audience, some opportunity to ask questions or to intervene?
I've been collecting some questions. I can ask some questions. I think we'll open the microphones towards the end of the questions, if that's okay. So I'll start at the very beginning. Harold asked, how did the book survive the Nazis?
There were the books of the Rosenthaljana and also the collections of the Jewish Museum were kept in a stone factory in the small town of Hungen, which is near Offenbach in Hessen in Germany. They were kept there. They were stored there. They were registered there by the Nazis, and they were found back by the Americans after the war, and were returned in the big program. Anyone have seen the Monuments Man movie, which is way too romantic. The American soldiers running after art. Actually, it were these, after Stalingrad, it were these units of the American army who did find back the large majority of the Jewish materials from Amsterdam, and they sent them back to Amsterdam in 1946. Largely unheard.
Very much. Eleanor asked if are any of the synagogues that you showed still functioning as synagogues today?
Yeah, the four synagogues of the Jewish Historical Museum no longer do. One of the interesting propositions about the Portuguese synagogue is the fact that we combine it. So there is still a living community, very active community, and the high holidays are usually taken care of in the big synagogue, in the Portuguese synagogue. There's also a winter synagogue that does have heating, that does have light, and that is the one that's a lot smaller, and that is the one that is being used for the regular services. It's a very small community. It's a community of less than 500 souls. So the decision in 2009 and made permanent in 2012 to work together with the Jewish Historical Museum to take care of that kind of heritage was also a necessary one. How can you expect a community of a few hundred souls to take care of one of the most majestic Jewish buildings that is around? How can you expect them to take care of one of the most important collections of ritual silver and textiles that is around in the world? How can you expect them to take care of the oldest Jewish library still functioning in the world? So we took over that control. There's state funding involved as well, and it's one way to safeguard it. And we have the combined facility of taking care of the collections, of showing the collections to a wider audience, organizing museum events, and a living community. And for those of you who are concerned, there's a statement in the contract: religion always comes first. So closed on Shabbat. The rest of our sites are not closed on Shabbat, but closed on Shabbat, closed on Jewish holidays, and then there's the wedding. When there's a wedding, there's a wedding.
Thank you very much. Just a note from me. There's so many compliments and nice things that are written in the chat. I'll absolutely send you the transcripts so that you can read them yourselves. Among them is also a shout out.
Personality, yeah, I shouldn't be reading it. Thank you.
Among them is a shout out from all of our good friends, William Gross, who said "Kol hakavod," both Emil and Yigal. Thank you, and everyone here. There's so many thanks and good compliments here, so I'll absolutely send them to you.
Half of what I told you I learned from Bill anyhow, so no worries.
Peter asked, you were showing the area where the museum and library are. Peter asked, don't you think that this is, that in this part of Amsterdam, there is so much sadness?
Yes, there is. And it's important to mention that, but and as Yigal was saying, the Dutch have the highest percentage of murdered Jews of any country outside, apart from Poland. Not the real number, but the percentage, and that is there. I mean, there's stolpersteinen all over the place, there's stumbling stones in the floor, and it makes you realize that all this is gone. But there is also a living community. There is also a continuation of Jewish life. It's a small community. It will never be as thriving as it was before the war, but the truth is also that even before the war, many people had already left the Jewish community. I mean, one of the tragedies of the Nazi identifying Amsterdam citizens only as Jews is the fact that it took away the idea that they were Amsterdammers, that they were people who were living in Amsterdam. That is the separation of the group that I mentioned before. So yes, it is there, but there is a thriving Jewish community. There is a very focal Jewish community, small but focal, and there is a continuation of Jewish life which we should celebrate. And we can celebrate it in many different ways. There's only we're talking 140,000 Jews were living in Holland before the war. 102,000 were murdered. The community now, people identify as Jewish are, let's say, between 40 and 50,000, which is less than half or somewhat more than a third of the original population. Many of those are not a member of the community. Membership of communities, we're talking probably less than 10,000. Most people identify culturally. But we shouldn't, it's about the self-identification that Yigal and I talked about. It's also a proud history. And it's the most tragic chapter shouldn't overshadow all the glory of what has been there, and both the importance and the potential of what is still there and developing anew.
Thank you very much. Barbara asked, how was this amazing machzor acquired? And what is its provenance history?
That's a good question. I mean, so it was. I was supposed to tell that actually. That's happened when you talk without text. 1679. It belonged to the Jewish community of Cologne. It probably left the Jewish community of Cologne after the Jews were told in the 14th century to leave the city of Cologne. It was 11, whatever. I mean, I don't know that from the top of my head. But in the 14th century, Jews were supposed to leave Cologne. This tradition of doing magnificent machzorim to be used by the Chazan by the Shaliach Tzibur in synagogues was a tradition that stopped after the pestilence outbreak and the enormous outburst of anti-Semitism in the 1350s. We don't know of the whereabouts of the manuscript up until the beginning of the 17th century, when we assumed that it was in the hands of the grandfather of this printer whom I mentioned, Uri Feivish Halevi. Uri Feivish Halevi had a reef, as he calls it in the manuscript, a quarrel going on with the Jewish community, and then donated the manuscript to the Jewish community as by way of settling the difficulty, possibly the financial problem that he had with the community. Then the manuscript stayed in the hands of the Jewish community of Amsterdam as of 1679. Was given on permanent loan, was used until the beginning of the Second World War. We don't know exactly whether it was really used, but it was part of the services, at least a part of the services, because the Minhag is not Minhag Amsterdam, it's Minhag Colonia. So it takes a lot of improvisation on the part of the Shaliach Tzibur to use it, but it was part of the celebrations, we know that. Then 1955, it was given on permanent loan to the Jewish Historical Museum upon its reopening. Then in 2012, 13, 14, the Jewish community indicated it became protected heritage, and the Jewish community indicated that it was considering to sell it. Like so many other, the Jewish community of Amsterdam, like so many other Jewish communities in Europe, United Synagogue in London, and a couple of other places, they were considering selling it because they needed the money to build a new synagogue or a new cultural center or whatever. Since it was protected heritage, it meant that it had to be decided upon by the Ministry of Culture. The laws for cultural heritage had changed in the meantime in 2015 when I came. In the past, there was a pot of money available in cases like these. So if the state would want the piece to stay and would not give the permission to sell, the state would be allowed to buy, would be forced to buy it. The money was no longer there because the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre bought two Rembrandts together, and the law changed. So the law changed to the effect that the market, whatever the market is, but the market had to be part of the efforts of a cultural institution to rescue such a cultural asset for the Dutch society. The Jewish Historical Museum was suggested by the Ministry of Culture to be the cultural institution that was supposed to show to the world that this manuscript should be saved. The sum of money is involved is public. We published it. It's 4 million euros. And the 4 million, which is a good sum of money for a manuscript like this, but it's the market. It's actually, I would say, below its present market value, in spite of the market. The painting that I started my presentation with, the Bergheide, was the biggest piece that the Jewish Museum had for 365,000 euros. and suddenly we were supposed to raise 4,000 euros with a capital with a budget of 8 million. So 4 million euros with a budget of 8 million euros. So we tried and we didn't manage. We reached out to many private collectors. There was only one private collector who was willing to help us, to push us a little bit forward. And that is the one whom we have already mentioned. And so we went, the state said, we're not going to do more than 25%. So at a certain point, and there was another Chanukiah, which was also part of this deal. And then we realized, it was my predecessor, Yoel Cohen, who actually gave us the first idea. We realized that there's a Jewish museum in Cologne, and there's a Cologne connection as well. Why not reach out to the Jewish museum, which is not opened yet in Cologne, and ask if they would be interested in a joint acquisition, like the Louvre and the Rijksmuseum had bought a Rembrandt, and like the Metropolitan Museum, the Met, and the Israel Museum had bought a Maimonides manuscript. So we reached out to the same people, and we were given permission to do that. And with a lot of, I would say, masam watan, we managed to raise, with the help of private individuals, with the help of certain foundations, and with the help of a number of private individuals and foundations in Cologne, to both raise 2 million euros towards the joint acquisition of this Amsterdam Machzor for the Jewish Museum of Amsterdam and the Jewish Museum of Cologne. And it will be shown 1 year in Cologne and 1 year in Amsterdam, and it will be asked to rest every couple of weeks, every couple of months as well. And we have it digitized. So if you go online to the Amsterdam Machzor, you can see the entire Machzor digitized online, and you will find it another wonderful website done by Ardon Bachama.
Thank you very much.
Exciting acquisition.
Thank you. There's a little conversation going on in the chat here, so I'll read a few of the remarks, and maybe you have something to add. Ruth wrote, I think it's desirable and a goal perhaps that most visitors to Jewish museums and Holocaust museums are not Jewish. Jews are a small minority, but Jewish history, culture, heritage, art, traditions, etc. are part of a parcel of European national, local history, culture, and heritage. So Edith agreed with Ruth, and then there's a remark from Aviva that says, I agree with Ruth Gruber. Jewish history, culture, heritage, art, traditions, etc. are part of the parcel of European national, local history, culture, and heritage. And there's a few more remarks, but maybe you can add something to this.
I always agree with Ruth Gruber, so that's not the that's no issue. Hi Ruth. Actually, I don't want to discriminate between audiences. So the truth is that in many places the non-Jewish audience, I'm not saying that anyone is, but I don't want to do that. Certain Jewish museums, especially smaller ones, have a different role within the local society than the big ones. We are totally dependent. I'm serious about that, and we realize that now. We're rethinking our programming even in these COVID-19 days, because we are, I would say, unhealthily depending on tourism, and that tourism is more than 50% Jewish, I would say. It will be Jewish tourists who come to us, but and others typically don't come to us. I do agree that it's important for society that they get to understand the Jewish history. But what I don't like is the instrumentalizing of Jewish history in certain public discussions. For example, in the Netherlands, as in the discussions about social integration of minorities as a successful history of integration, as if the Jewish presence in the Netherlands of 400 years were only important to society as a token to illustrate the fact that it is possible that minorities integrate. Because for me, it's important that people understand the important role that the Jews played in that society. But it's also important that people understand how many Jews didn't play an important role in that society, and were just poor, and were peddlers, and were everything. They were part and parcel of that society. to use the same phrase. And so it's all about the balancing the item. And the other thing is, I think, which is really an important role, is something that is connected to what we discussed before, which is the question, or the fact that Jewish museums, in my view, are also there to deal with this very issue that we discussed, which is the diminishing Jewish identity to the Holocaust. It should also be a celebration of, or an illustration, or whatever way we phrase it. Sometimes it's celebratory, sometimes less celebratory, but it should be an illustration of the normality of Jewish presence in our Western societies. And one of the things that bugs me as a manuscript person is, when I look for Hebrew manuscripts, I have to go to the Oriental division. My manuscripts were done in Worms, in Amsterdam, in London, in Russia, in Spain. There's nothing Oriental about them. The script is Oriental, but it's part of European history. So why should it be Oriental studies? And I'm not going to use the B word, but it's just not correct. And it shows, it has to do with an appropriation and with an identification of Jewish identity as something foreign. And I see that the most important role for a Jewish museum is to see it as something natural, integrated into society, and not as an outside. Work on the outsider, work on getting rid of the outsider perspective.
Thank you. Orit asked two questions. I'm sorry. First of all, I have to apologize to all the people who wrote questions that I'm skipping over. We're just coming close to the limit of time we can be here. So my apologies. Orit asked two questions. I'll ask them together. Does the professor think that Jewish items should be presented in their community, even though the community does not exist anymore? And the second question is, are there any items you would say must stay in Israel?
There's two questions. I think that the most important concern of heritage professionals in general, when it comes to Jewish sites in let's say in Europe, but also in South America, and probably also already in the US, should not be the presentation, but the preservation. So I think that the most important thing is that once a community does no longer exists, and the Jewish items are there, and Jewish groups or non-Jewish groups, because especially in places like Austria and Germany, it was often local non-Jewish initiative that saved the material. And the most important concern is the safeguarding and seeing to it that it's being preserved, and see to it that it is being kept in the best possible circumstances. And only the second concern should then be to present it to the public. I think that is an important step, one step going before Ishan, because there are many places in which, and it also happens in churches, by the way, in cathedrals all over Europe, in which I see fantastically wonderful, valuable, historically valuable, monetarily valuable materials being presented in a religious or formally religious setting under circumstances which either destroy the object in the long run, or even in the medium run, or make them vulnerable to theft. So we first have to take that responsibility. In terms of the role of Israel, it's a very, very complicated question, which is a matter of, I think it's another one of our discussion, probably what that means. I think that what you see today is a change in the way that Jewish communities outside Israel face the centrality of Israel as a depository for Jewish culture. The self-definition of the Jewish National University Library, and in a way also of the Bezalel and Yisrael Museum, was the place where, especially after the Second World War in the 1940s and early 1950s, lots of the materials that were sent back, the orphaned, I would almost say, materials that that were left without ownership after the Second World War, were sent to Israel, and everybody considered that a normal development. Everybody considered it the most natural place to store materials. And that attitude worldwide is changing. People are reclaiming, local communities, private owners are reclaiming ownership of materials. And the decision back then, was a decision that almost everybody agreed upon. So that is very difficult. I find that very difficult to deal with that question in detail. I think that Israeli institutions have an obligation to be open about where it comes from, where the material comes from. And I also think that Israeli institutions have a right to fight for the materials that they have. So it's because they are taking the concerns that I was expressing before, taking care of there was a situation with Etz Chaim, I didn't mention that. That's a good example. The situation, Amsterdam, the library of Etz Chaim in the late 1970s was not taken care of properly by the Portuguese Jewish community. It was given on a semi-permanent loan to the National Library, to the then Jewish National University Library. The books were there until the late 1990s, or even a little bit later than that. And when I came into this field in the 1980s, I was told about the enormous disgrace of these books being taken away by Israel and stolen from the Portuguese Jewish community. And the truth of the matter is that the Panazim of the community were the ones who offered the library to Malachi Bet Aye, who was then the director of the Jewish National University Library, and told to me, listen, if I am offered the oldest Jewish library in the world on a permanent loan, as the library of the Jewish people, how am I ever going to say no to that? And when the community reorganized in the 1990s, and when the library reorganized in the 1990s and early 2000s, the books were actually returned. So there was no disgrace whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is that these books the situation a lot better now, were taken care of a lot better in Jerusalem than they were taken care of in Amsterdam before they were sent to Jerusalem. So I would say that at the end of the day, our main concern should always be the preservation. And what is best for the item and how can we secure preservation? But I just mentioned a figure on the Amsterdam Mahzor of 4 million. We're talking about big paintings, we're talking about important silver. These items don't only have a cultural value, they also have a monetary value. And they also have an historical and a cultural value for local communities, even if they're not necessarily directly connected to. It's difficult times. I mean, I remember when I spoke with Ido Bruno, the director of the Israel Museum, not too long ago. We were both saying to each other, the issue of ownership and restitution is one of the biggest issues that we have to deal with. I'm not going to solve it here.
Thank you very much. Again, I apologize to everyone who I'm skipping over their questions. I did put a link in the chat where people can see future events and past events. This event as well has been recorded and will go up hopefully online within a few days. There's also a link that I put in there for in case anyone would like to donate to the library to help us get through this time. I will open microphones at the end of your answer to the next question. Craig asked, for those outside Holland, how can we support the museum?
There are many different ways to support the museum. We have go online, go to jck.nl and go online and try and find the link to the thing. I can also actually see if we can add the link to the online presentation. I can send you the link for donations. We have an American group of friends as well. So those of you who are interested in the tax deduction, you can also do that through our American Foundation for Friends. And one of the advantages, which is also a disadvantage of my position, is that I'm relatively easily found online. So if you hit any problems, don't hesitate, either with a question or with a with a suggestion for a donation in case you can't find the material online. So we have groups of friends, ways to support the Holocaust Museum, there are ways to support the Jewish Historical Museum. We have an American Foundation, and please be welcome. Come to Amsterdam once our world gets back to normal as well. That's very important. And visit us online. We have a virtual Jewish Quarter online at the moment. Some of that content is in English. And feel free to come and feel free to continue to support us. And
Emil, it was for me a pleasure to talk to you, and I have the privilege to be able to talk to you tomorrow too, and after tomorrow. So it was great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you both very much from us as well. Also, I would like to let everyone know that there are more chapters of this series about Jewish museums around the world. And thank you very much. I will open the microphone so that everyone can say thank you in person. Thank you and have a good night. We'll see everybody in the next event.
Thank you.
Marvelous program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Come on.
רבה, היה מקסים, נפלא.
Bedankt, goedenavond. תודה רבה.
Bye.
Thank you.
Dank je wel.
Quality info.
Alsjeblieft. Thank you.
Thank you from Canada.
Van Zuid-Afrika, baie dankie.
Dank je wel.
Hungarian, Kessenem.
תודה מניו יורק.
Thank you. תודה רבה.
Brakasha.
Dank je wel. תודה רבה.
Heel graag gedaan. Dank je. This is fun.
Come to Israel. We are fun.
Not bad, Emil.
Thank you. Well, I had a good example. I learned everything from you.
Thank you from California.
You brought out the best in him, Yigal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
How do I get onto...
יגאל, טוב לראות אותך.
על הכיפאק, יופי, תודה.
דש לאשתך אגנס.
אני כבר מוסר לה.
טוב.
Holocaust fatigue is a subject we need to deal with as well. Marcel from Washington. We have noticed that is even among the Jewish community, there is that phenomenon.
I could have dealt with that. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
We haven't noticed it to the extent that it's happening in Washington, apparently.
Yeah. Among all the complexities that we have to deal with, we have that, unfortunately, as well. And that's different to Holocaust denial. That's a whole different. Different.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emil.
Okay, pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
שלום אמיל ויגאל, יוסי צמח מאמסטרדם.
כן, ראיתי אותך, יופי, שלום, שלום.
שתהיה בריא, יגאל, דש בבית.
טוב לראות אותך, אני אמסור.
אמיל, see you soon.
Okay, see you soon. Yeah, take care.
Stay well, everybody. Stay
Beautiful presentation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
יגאל, שלום מוונציה, פגשתי אותך שנה שעברה פה.
נכון, בטח. יופי.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
Shalom.
תודה רבה. להתראות.
להתראות. שלום.
להתראות. שלום. ביי ביי.
ביי.
Bye-bye. I have to say leave because otherwise we won't leave.
Thank you, Emil.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Emil, your English is par excellence, Marcel.
Thank you. Thank you.
My Dutch is
Emil. Thank you, Emil.
My pleasure.
by a donkey.
Thank you.
Thank you.